Today we're going to be going over the idea of the existence of God and if there's any reason to really bother with this sort of thing. Welcome to session 3 of Living Over Surviving. My name is Noah, and last episode we kind of ended off with the idea of God, and that's kind of where level 4 happiness brings us, right? And so now we're going to see if there's actually any merit to that sort of idea. And so let's start off from the very beginning. How do we think that the world started, right? The general consensus is the Big Bang. Everything just kind of popped into existence out of nothing, and that's kind of that, right? And high school science tells us that this theory kind of sucks if we take a step back and look at it, right? Since the beginning, we were taught that matter can't be created nor destroyed, right? And the same with energy, right? Laws of conservation. Then we get into thermodynamics and then motion and all that once we get into the later years of university and whatever else, whatever courses we're taking. But pretty much something can't come from nothing. And this is really intuitive, right? So saying that it just sort of happened is kind of a garbage answer, right? It's the biggest trust me bro of the science world. Because how could everything pop into existence if there was nothing there to begin with, right? Going deeper into the theory, apparently everything was contained within this thing they call a singularity, right? Apparently it was the size of a football. But how did it exist in the first place? And what kind of space did it inhabit? What kind of space did it exist in? Because if there was a pop into being, there must also have been a force put on the little football to make it pop in the first place, right? So there are a lot of variables that just turn into trust me bros when we just say it just kind of happened, right? We're all here, so obviously something did happen. We know that for anything to be made or produced, it's got to be made of things that already exist. And this is obvious, right? For anything to occur, there must have been something responsible for that result. And the best theory we have right now is that it just kind of happened. And so, what I'd like to get at here is that maybe science has nothing here for us, but this means that we can now make it a philosophical question and think about existence as a concept. So, if everything is going to be made of something and is the result of an action, what could those be if the result is existence itself, right? Because there could be nothing before existence, right? Because then we get this weird cycle where we can just go, okay, existence is A, and it had to get here somehow. So we could just say it got here by B, but then B must have gotten here somehow. So let's just call that C. And so A needs B, needs C, C must need D, right? And we get this loop of bullshit where nothing can really happen because it always depends on something else, and we can never really verify where that initial point comes from, right? We just know that it does have something. So where does it all stop? For the whole cycle to exist in the first place, there must be something that started it. And we can call this a first cause or a first mover because it's the whole thing, or it's the first thing that put everything into motion, right? And this must be something that doesn't need anything else for it to exist, right? It's responsible and completely sufficient for its own existence all by itself. Like, it's a big boy. Like, it could do it all by itself. And this is the thing that kicked off everything, right? Started our little cycle. And this little thing that kicked off everything, conceptually, is God. And that's what we'll call it for the rest of the episode. And so there are a few conclusions that we could draw from this. Since God is responsible for our little cycle, because it's the only thing that doesn't need something else to have a start, and it was the only reason why everything else exists. Since he made everything, since God made everything, God's also not confined or subject to the same dimensions that we are, like time and place. Since God made them, and that means God existed before them, God must also be outside of time and space, and by default could have full reign over them, right? Unlike us, who are confined by them because we are present at a point in time and we occupy a place at all times. Hopefully, this isn't too crazy. And that's why you could sometimes hear people say, there's no time in God, or God is everywhere, right? Because God doesn't necessarily have those same limitations like we do, because he was before everything. A lot of people don't like the concept of God, and this is completely reasonable, I would say. It's an understandable position. Because they usually say something like, if God exists, then how do you explain X, right? And this could be, anything as mundane as like, oh, my kid breaks his arm, or my girl breaks up with me, or I get into a fender bender. Or it could be something substantial like war, or kids with cancer, or something like that. And this is a great question. But it deals more with if God is good or not so much if God exists. And right now, at the time of recording, whether God is good or not is scheduled to be session 21. So you'll just have to subscribe and stick around, I guess. And fun fact, anyways, that episode on whether God is good or not is actually my favorite one. And so, from our little existential cycle, the only form of spirituality that we could kind of discard at this point is the belief that the universe itself is some sentient force. Because clearly there's something higher than it, since it exists in the same plane as we do, so it was produced just like we were, right? So the universe kind of isn't doing shit, right? God made the universe, so talk to God instead of some stars or empty space. God, being outside of time and space, made everything. And this actually makes the Big Bang kind of reasonable, right? So maybe it's not full of shit, even though it's a huge trust me, bro, because then we're only dealing with the science, and that's where it's completely insufficient. We could bring in philosophy and actually find some sense in it. Because then we could just say that God is responsible for the pop that brought everything into being. And that's exactly the thought process of the guy who made it. Because it turned out to be some priest in Belgium. I'm going to probably butcher his last name. Father George Lemaitre. Probably good enough. But one thing that we could use from a previous episode to add on to this is just like how everyone is drawn to happiness, it must exist. Otherwise, it wouldn't even be a thing to us, right? It would be a completely foreign, unattainable concept. And every idea that we have must have some kind of inspiration that we could draw on from somewhere else. And the one thing to note is that man has always been religious or had at least a sense of the divine. From the very beginning, the inclination towards belief was even present among like knuckle draggers who couldn't conceptualize really anything. And so they looked for it anywhere, like in trees or the sun or rocks or something. But where did they even get the inspiration that something beyond was there anyways, right? The idea of God definitely would have been a foreign concept to them, especially at their level, because these are people whose like main form of diplomacy was like rock, and then they would just bludgeon each other or something like that. Like these aren't necessarily intellectuals, right? And God is a pretty complex concept, right? And it's pretty outside of ourselves. And I don't know if you think that those guys were smart enough or capable of just thinking up a concept as complex as that. I don't know. You're bullshitting me. Because these are guys who didn't even have a developed language, but all of them had a sense of the divine, and that's obviously kind of problematic. We can't really think of brand new concepts. We can only ever make new things by taking bits and pieces from concepts that we're already familiar with. So these tribes people smacking rocks together simply wouldn't have had the means of making sophisticated ideas. And so they must have been inspired externally. And this could only ever occur if God exists. Right? And these are pretty easy things to grasp, but the implications are pretty wild. Right? Just like how happiness is attainable for everyone, regardless of our abilities, because we're all drawn to it and we have that innate sense of it. And if we weren't capable of it, then it would be completely foreign and it wouldn't really be anything we could even acknowledge or be drawn to in the first place. And so, with our little cycle, although it was a very short explanation, I think we have a decent case for the existence of God. And this is obviously by no means exhaustive, right? There are tons of other arguments. But when we take a step back and we think about existence as a concept and see, okay, well, God must be responsible, or the thing responsible for existence must be at least outside of whatever our scope of reality is. And calling that God, that's really the only option we have. And at the moment, anyways, where we are right now, there's nothing concretely compelling us to believe. And so, okay, God exists. Great. My life is still mid, so like, what's in it for me? And that's understandable. And this is likely the last time we'll talk about it. Pascal's wager. And since we covered it in episode 0, and I don't really remember, I haven't recorded episode 2 yet at the time of recording this, and so we'll just breeze through the wager really quickly again. And this will certainly be the last time we cover it, at least until super late in the game. So let's see if there's any actual incentive to believe in God, and there are 4 little quick scenarios. So God exists, and we live with faith, and we live well. So we follow some rules, essentially, in this pathway. We're morally upright, or we try to be anyways. We deny ourselves whatever activity the religion we choose discourages or just outright bans. We help people even though we may not want to. That's the whole concept around charity, because obviously it's taking on some burdens to be good. But you wouldn't mind doing all those things because you'll at least feel fulfilled from your belief and that you're making progress towards your goal, which is going to be heaven. Right, so you're living meaningfully, you're focusing on being fulfilled, you won't fear death, you may even look forward to it, and you die. And since God exists in this one, God's waiting for you, and since you allegedly did well, you get to stay in paradise and you get your happily ever after. So you go to heaven, you made it. Great. Now for another scenario. God exists and you don't live with faith or really care at all. We do whatever we want, whenever we want, whether it's good or bad. We just live on our own terms, doing whatever's best only for us, throwing aside any kind of suggestions or guidance from philosophy or religion, really pretty much anything that is in conflict with whatever we want to do at the time. And so we could get exposed to some decent ideas, but it doesn't necessarily mean we have to care because it's nothing to us. So there's no thought given to anything incompatible with our preferred lifestyles. And we die. And God's looking at your record because he exists in this one. And he's going, what the fuck is all this? And that's kind of that, because now we don't really have anything to justify our positions with, because we just threw away or disregarded everything that was incompatible with our worldview, but we ended up being wrong in this case. And in that scenario, chances are we'll have nothing to say since we rejected the call, and by default we would be going to hell. Now, for if God doesn't exist and we live with faith and do all the things associated with that, just like in the first scenario, we lived life with meaning or like some kind of direction, not fearing death, maybe, likely. We would have had a positive difference, or we would have tried to make a positive difference in the lives of those around us, and we would have cared for others, generally doing so good, and for sure, taking on more burdens, denying ourselves pleasures here and there, and maybe even having some added stress of being, oh, okay, well, am I in a right relationship with God? And so we do all these things, and we die. And that's it. All the good you did, all the sacrifices you made, any stress from not being able to live up to expectation, or stress from missing the mark, all those hours you spent praying as well throughout your life, all of it was for nothing. But here, you're dead. So you don't really get the chance to realize that anyways. Your last moments, you died looking forward to a paradise that never came, but you still thought it was there, and you'll never get the chance to realize that there is nothing there. So nothing happens. And it's really inconsequential, at least it seems that way, but that's just the life well lived, at least subjectively. And so now, if God doesn't exist and we don't live well, or with faith, or trying to do good, or anything like that, we live on our own terms, doing whatever we want, treating people however we want. We can be materialists, hedonists, greedy, lustful, vengeful, whatever, whatever. And we don't even necessarily have to do all that. We just don't have to. We live on our own terms, pretty much. And we die. And God doesn't exist. So nothing good or bad happens to us. Right? The story ends there. We maxed out our earthly lives doing whatever we want in whatever cycle we put ourselves in, and we chased those highs, and we got our fill, and that's it. And so when we look at the end goals, or the end game, the end scenarios for each of those four paths, if God doesn't exist and you don't believe or care about the good, then you get to live however you want on your own terms, and that's it. No regrets, no repercussions, no rewards, nothing. If God doesn't exist and you believe anyways, and you live as if God does exist, you live a meaningful life pursuing God and heaven. You'll likely feel fulfilled, maybe die excited, maybe leave a positive impact on people because you were at least incentivized to do so. And that's it. You thought you did everything right, and you died with meaning and direction. If God exists and you believe and you live like it, then you get that meaningful life, and you also get to go to heaven. But if God exists and you live as if he doesn't, and you just do whatever, you go to hell, theoretically. So from the potential paths we could take, it seems like there's really no reason not to believe. Because overall, the worst case scenario is that we go to hell on the chance that God exists, but we never really took it seriously or cared. And the best case scenario among all those is that God exists and we go to heaven because we did everything right, or at least gave it a shot, right? But the beauty of the wager is that it shows that even if God doesn't exist, even if it's all fake, that there's no real downside to belief. Because we've seen how empty levels 1 and 2 are in episode 0 and in episode 2. And with the alternative being a meaningful life, there isn't really much to consider. With belief, we either win everything or we lose nothing, because a subjective experience, by all standards, was meaningful. And we had direction, purpose, an approach to suffering. Everything was laid out for us. And also, once you get into it even further, a relief from anxiety. But obviously, that depends. We'll talk about it later. And without belief, we could lose everything. Because what if God exists? And we lived as if we didn't really give a shit. All the wager does is give us some scenarios. It tells us what the stakes are. And it compels us at least to think a little bit about our beliefs, or maybe at least gives us the incentive to start a search for God. Because these beliefs influence pretty much everything about us, right? Our approach to people, our demeanor, our outlook on life and death, how we make sense of suffering, which gives us the hope that we need to tackle the future. It gives us hope for the future. It also helps us to see life as meaningful or not. And so this belief is really foundational in terms of how fulfilling our lives will be. And luckily for us, we have some pretty solid evidence that we could win big. Because, at least from the cycle, it appears as though if God didn't exist, nothing would. But even if it's all bullshit anyways, it doesn't seem like there's much for us to lose anyways. Because even if it's all fake, but we live with meaning and do all those things, we still come out on top. This session, though, is about level 4 happiness. Level 4 compels us to pursue perfection. And even though we haven't proven God is perfect yet, I think it's understandable enough right now to assume that the pursuit is for God. The pursuit of perfection in level 4 is for God and for heaven. And it gives us that lifelong journey. And it gives us a sufficient reason and incentive to do good for others, even when we don't really want to, which is the moral side of level 3. And if we're consistently on that journey towards the divine, there's no real opportunity to crash, since we're either on that journey or we're not. And we can only ever see the high of level 4 once we die. And that's why there is no crash, because we only ever find it at the very end. But we're not going to be alive to see the result anyways. The philosophy tells us that there is something on the other side, and that the only way that any of this is possible is for God to exist. And internalizing these truths and starting our own journey is a huge part of the battle when it comes to living happily and meaningfully. Remember that we could be in all 4 levels at once. And that's essentially the human experience. We can still enjoy great meals and pleasures. We could still find joy in being appreciated, complimented, and praised in our relationships. We can enjoy and feel accomplished in making a difference and helping people and having big undertakings. But we couldn't go, or we shouldn't go, all in on any one of those things. Because level 4 gives us the context into how we live our lives, because then it puts everything into perspective. It tells us about all the different cycles that we're pigeonholing ourselves in when we decide to go for any one particular level overactively. And level 4 gives us that direction that we need for lasting happiness, because it's an endless journey. Without it, we will fall to whatever's immediate and apparent, like all the hedonists or materialists, or people with superiority complexes in levels 1 and 2, which is a cycle that only ever trends downwards and makes for a terrible existence. And we haven't touched on religion at all, really. But with the guidance that we can get from philosophy and the healthy approaches that we can get from internal work, I think we have an amazingly comprehensive guideline as to how we could live happily and make our lives more beautiful and worth living. Because it changes our approach to everything. It tells us what our purpose is. It compels us to love more fully and to be more understanding, which improves our relationships. It gives us hope in times of desperation and can even take away the mental and emotional toll of suffering, which we will cover later, because that one is certainly something that isn't immediately evident, even considering God just existing. And all these things give us the explanation of why and how we exist, which we'll also cover later. But in the midst of all this, probably the best part and the one thing that we can really cling to, if there's one thing you ever really need to remember, from this episode anyways, is that even if it's all bullshit, but you still live like God exists, you still come out on top. And that is my case for God. Have a good night.